In the quiet hours before sunrise, when Istanbul still slept beneath a pale sky, something was said to have broken the silence inside Topkapi Palace. It was not the sound of drums, prayers, or palace guards changing shifts. According to later whispers, it was the cry of a young girl, a sound sharp enough to echo through marble corridors built for emperors, not fear. The year was 1623. The Ottoman Empire stood at the height of its power. Its armies ruled lands across 3 continents. Its sultan commanded absolute authority. Yet behind the golden gates of the palace, far from battlefields and banners, a different kind of story was unfolding, one that official history would never record. The girl at the center of the rumors was Fatima Sultan, only 15 years old. She was born into luxury, surrounded by fountains, silk curtains, and servants trained to obey without question. From the outside, her life appeared blessed. From the inside, it was governed by rules so strict that even her thoughts were not fully her own. Palace storytellers later claimed that, on the morning of her wedding, Fatima Sultan cried out in terror. Some said she begged. Others said she screamed until her voice broke. The eunuchs guarding the inner halls were said to have frozen in place, unsure whether they were even allowed to acknowledge what they heard. No doors opened, no records were written. By sunrise, the palace returned to perfect order. Official chronicles described the day as glorious. Feasts were prepared. Musicians arrived from distant provinces. Diplomats admired the empire's wealth and discipline. The wedding of an imperial princess was meant to be a symbol of strength and stability. Nothing in the records suggested fear, resistance, or suffering. Yet rumors spread because silence creates questions. Among the servants, among dismissed attendants, among later writers who claimed access to forbidden papers, a darker story circulated. They whispered that Ottoman princesses feared their wedding night more than illness or death, not because of the husband alone, but because of something that happened before the door to the bridal chamber ever closed. These stories spoke of preparation, not gentle guidance, but a system meant to strip a princess of pride, choice, and voice. They claimed that before marriage, imperial daughters were taught obedience through ritual, repetition, and humiliation. The goal was simple. When the wedding night arrived, resistance would already be gone. No European court described such practices. No official Ottoman document confirmed them. And yet, the same pattern appeared again and again in gossip and legend. Princesses who entered marriage young. Princesses who emerged silent. Princesses who lived long lives afterward, but never truly returned. Fatima Sultan's story became the most famous example, not because it was unique, but because it survived in fragments. A scream, a wedding, a sudden change in character. A brilliant young girl who became a shadow behind palace walls. This part of the story does not claim certainty. It begins with uncertainty, with a scream no one admitted hearing, with a silence carefully maintained, and with a question history still refuses to answer. If the empire was so powerful, why were its own daughters so afraid of one single night? Inside the vast body of the Ottoman Empire, power was measured in armies, gold, and territory. But within the palace walls, power followed different rules. The most controlled space of all was the imperial harem, a world sealed behind guarded doors where every movement was watched and every word carried consequences. To outsiders, it was imagined as a place of pleasure and luxury. But for those born inside it, especially the daughters of the Sultan, it functioned more like a silent prison built from silk, marble, and tradition. Princesses were raised from childhood with the clear understanding that their lives did not belong to them. From the moment they could walk, they were taught how to sit, how to lower their eyes, how to speak softly, and most importantly, how to obey without hesitation. Their education was rich in language, poetry, religion, and history, yet it always carried a hidden lesson. Knowledge did not grant freedom. It only made obedience more refined. Unlike concubines, who could sometimes rise in status by gaining the sultan's favor, imperial princesses were trapped by their blood. They were too valuable to be free. Each princess was a living contract, a future alliance waiting to be signed through marriage. When the empire faced rebellion, instability, or ambitious governors, a daughter of the dynasty could be offered as a solution. Marriage was not discussed with the princess. It was announced to her, often suddenly, as a completed decision. The man chosen was usually older, powerful, and politically useful. Love was never part of the calculation. Fear, however, was. As girls grew older, they began to notice a pattern that disturbed them deeply. Princesses who married rarely returned the same. Some became silent. Others avoided eye contact. A few withdrew completely from palace life, appearing only when protocol demanded it. Their laughter disappeared. Their interests faded. Servants whispered that the change always came after the wedding night, but no one dared explain why. Questions were dangerous in a place where silence was survival. Stories circulated quietly among the women of the harem. They spoke of strict preparations before marriage, of lessons that were never written down, of rituals disguised as religious duty. Young princesses learned not to ask too much. They learned to listen instead. Fear did not come from imagination alone. It came from watching what happened to those who went before them. Every marriage felt like a warning. For Fatima Sultan, these lessons were impossible to ignore. She had seen older princesses vanish into marriages arranged far from the palace. She had heard the change in their voices when they returned for brief ceremonies. She understood that being a sultan's daughter did not protect her from suffering. It only ensured that her suffering would be hidden well. The palace presented marriage as honor, destiny, and service to the empire. But behind closed doors, it felt like surrender. As Fatima approached the age of marriage, the fear she carried was not childish anxiety. It was the fear of someone who knew that once the decision was made, there would be no escape, no refusal, and no record left behind to tell her side of the story. As the decision for Fatima Sultan's marriage became final, her world quietly narrowed. Lessons in poetry and astronomy were reduced. Visitors stopped coming. The familiar gardens of the palace felt farther away each day, even though she remained inside the same walls. What replaced her education was never officially named. No document called it a ritual. No court record described it as training. Yet among the women of the harem, there was an understanding that something changed once a princess crossed a certain invisible line. From that moment, she was no longer treated as a child of the dynasty, but as a bride to be shaped. The language around her softened, but the rules became harder. Every action was corrected. Every habit was examined. Even silence was supervised. Older attendants were assigned to her, women whose loyalty was to the palace, not to the girl in front of them. They spoke calmly, rarely raising their voices, but their authority was absolute. Fatima was taught precise movements for walking, sitting, and lowering her head. Her hands were trained to remain still. Her gaze was trained to fall at the correct moment. These were presented as lessons in dignity and modesty, yet repetition turned them into something closer to conditioning. Mistakes were not punished with violence, but with isolation, fasting, or endless correction until exhaustion erased resistance. The process did not bruise the body. It wore down the will. Whispers claimed that even her speech changed. Words of confidence and curiosity were gently discouraged. Expressions of opinion were labeled unnecessary. Over time, her vocabulary narrowed to polite agreement and gratitude. When she asked questions, she was reminded that obedience itself was a form of wisdom. Religion was used carefully, not harshly, but constantly. Verses were repeated about duty, sacrifice, and patience. Prayer became less about personal faith and more about acceptance. The message was subtle but relentless. Her future belonged to others, and peace would only come if she stopped resisting that truth. The most disturbing rumors spoke of preparation for the wedding night itself, not instruction in affection or partnership, but rehearsal in submission. These accounts were never written openly, only passed in fragments by later storytellers and dismissed servants. They described symbolic lessons meant to remove fear by replacing it with obedience. Whether exaggerated or not, the effect on Fatima was visible. Those who saw her during this time noticed a change in her posture, her voice, and her presence. She moved as if every step required permission. She spoke as if words were borrowed, not owned. What frightened her most was not pain, but the loss of herself. She understood that resistance would not stop the marriage. It would only make the process longer and harder. The palace did not need to threaten her with death or disgrace. It only needed to convince her that obedience was the only path left. Slowly, the brilliant young girl, who once debated scholars, learned the most dangerous lesson of all. Silence was safer than truth. By the time the wedding day approached, Fatima Sultan was no longer openly afraid. To the palace, this looked like calm. In reality, it was resignation. The fear had not disappeared. It had simply sunk deeper, waiting for the moment when the door to the bridal chamber would finally close and nothing more could be done. As the wedding day drew closer, the palace transformed. Courtyards were cleaned until the marble shone like water. Silk banners were raised. Musicians arrived from distant regions, and kitchens worked without rest to prepare feasts meant to impress the city and foreign observers alike. To the outside world, this was a moment of triumph. A sultan's daughter was being married, and the empire wished to display its wealth, order, and divine favor. But while Istanbul prepared to celebrate, Fatima Sultan was being quietly removed from everything familiar to her. Several days before the ceremony, she was taken to the bridal pavilion, a separate and carefully controlled space within the palace grounds. Officially, it was a place of purification and rest, designed to prepare the bride's body and spirit for marriage. In reality, it functioned as a final stage of isolation. From the moment she entered, every part of her day was regulated. She no longer chose when to eat, sleep, bathe, or pray. Attendants watched constantly, not out of cruelty, but out of duty. Nothing was allowed to interrupt the schedule, because the schedule itself was the point. Her diet was reduced to carefully selected foods, honey, milk, nuts, and fruit, said to calm the body and steady the mind. Bathing became ritualized, with scented oils and warm water poured slowly over her skin while prayers were recited. What might have felt comforting under other circumstances instead became a reminder that her body no longer belonged to her. Every act of care carried an unspoken message. This body was being prepared for transfer, like a sacred object moving from one owner to another. Inside the pavilion, the walls spoke as clearly as the attendants. Tapestries depicted obedient wives and triumphant unions. Stories carved into stone showed loyalty rewarded and defiance erased. Mirrors were placed deliberately, forcing Fatima to see herself at every turn. She could not escape her own reflection, a young girl dressed as a bride, watching herself become someone else. The palace called this self-awareness. In practice, it became a quiet form of control. Meanwhile, outside the pavilion, the empire celebrated. Drums echoed through the city. Processions filled the streets. To the people, this was a fairy tale made real. Few imagined that the bride at the center of it all spent her days in silence, monitored, corrected, and slowly detached from the life she once knew. No one asked how she felt. No one needed to. The role of a princess was not to feel, but to fulfill. By the final night before the wedding, Fatima Sultan had learned what the palace truly demanded. It did not require her love, her happiness, or even her understanding. It required only her compliance. The fear that once showed on her face had faded, not because it was gone, but because it had nowhere left to go. When she lay down to sleep for the last time as an unmarried girl, she did not cry out. She did not resist. She simply waited, knowing that when morning came, celebration would drown out whatever remained of her voice. The wedding day arrived with overwhelming noise and color. From dawn until nightfall, Istanbul pulsed with celebration. Processions moved through the streets, musicians played without pause, and the palace overflowed with guests, eager to witness a union presented as a blessing for the empire. Gold trays carried food through the halls. Incense burned in heavy clouds. To the world outside the palace walls, this was proof that the dynasty remained strong, ordered, and favored by fate. Yet at the center of it all, Fatima Sultan moved like a shadow, dressed in layers of white silk and gold so heavy that each step required effort. The clothing meant to honor her instead restricted her, forcing her body into stillness and obedience. As the sun set and the celebrations began to quiet, the moment everyone had been preparing for finally arrived. Fatima was led away from the music and lights and toward the bridal chamber. Officially, this was the moment of union, sanctified by tradition and religion. Unofficially, it was the moment that mattered most to the state. The marriage was not considered complete until the night had passed according to expectation. Attendants remained close, listening, waiting, ensuring that nothing interfered with what the empire required to happen behind closed doors. The chamber itself was designed to inspire awe and submission. Tapestries on the walls depicted victories, conquests, and obedient wives, reminding the bride that she was part of something larger than herself. Perfumed lamps filled the air, and ritual prayers were spoken, turning a deeply personal moment into a formal act of duty. Fatima's body trembled, not from cold, but from fear she could no longer express. By this point, resistance had been trained out of her. Silence had become her only shield. The man she was married to was not chosen for kindness or compatibility, but for usefulness. To him, the marriage represented advancement, honor, and power. To her, it represented the end of choice. What happened inside the chamber was never described directly in records. Chroniclers used careful, coded language, speaking only of completion and success. Later storytellers filled the silence with darker interpretations, describing fainting, panic, and emotional collapse. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, they all agreed on one thing. Fatima did not emerge from that night unchanged. By morning, the empire declared the marriage a triumph. Guests congratulated one another. Gifts were exchanged. Prayers of thanks were offered. But those who saw Fatima afterward noticed the difference immediately. Her eyes no longer searched the room. Her voice, when it appeared at all, was faint. The vibrant young woman known for her intelligence and curiosity seemed to have withdrawn deep inside herself. The night the empire needed to happen had passed exactly as planned. Stability was preserved. Alliances were secured. Yet the cost was invisible to everyone except the one who paid it. What the palace celebrated as duty fulfilled marked the beginning of a silence that would follow Fatima Sultan for the rest of her life. After the wedding night, life inside the palace continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Ceremonies followed their schedules. Officials carried on their duties. Chroniclers praised the success of the union using careful, empty phrases that revealed nothing of the human cost behind them. In public, Fatima Sultan fulfilled her role as a dutiful wife of the dynasty. She appeared at formal events, dressed in splendor, standing beside her husband in silence. To the empire, this was proof that everything had gone as planned. To those who truly watched her, it was evidence that something had been permanently lost. Those closest to her noticed changes that could not be explained away. Fatima spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was low and uncertain. She avoided prolonged eye contact and startled easily at sudden sounds. Activities that once defined her, reading, music, discussion, disappeared from her daily life. The young woman who had once debated scholars and studied the stars now spent long hours withdrawn, staring at nothing. Palace physicians recorded symptoms using vague terms common to the time: weakness of the spirit, melancholy, nervous fevers. No one wrote the word trauma, but the silence around her said enough. Her marriage continued because it had to. Children were born. Public duties were performed. Yet private accounts suggest that the bond between husband and wife remained distant and mechanical. What had begun as a political arrangement never became companionship. Some later writers claimed that even her husband sought escape in long campaigns and substances meant to dull memory. Whether true or not, the pattern remained clear. The marriage existed on paper, not in the heart. Fatima lived for many years after that night, but she never returned to who she had been. The palace recorded her death as an illness, offering no further detail. Rumors, however, noted the strange coincidence that her health often worsened around the anniversary of her wedding. Whispers claimed that her spirit had been broken long before her body failed. Like so many women of royal blood, her inner life vanished from history the moment it became inconvenient to acknowledge. Her story matters not because it can be proven in every detail, but because it reflects a wider pattern. Many Ottoman princesses faded from the records after marriage. Some lived quietly in distant households. Others disappeared behind carefully chosen words like withdrawal or illness. A few names vanished entirely. Historians suspect that despair, madness, and even suicide were hidden behind polite language meant to protect the image of the dynasty. The empire was powerful, disciplined, and admired, but its greatness demanded sacrifice. And too often, that sacrifice was paid by women who had no voice in their own fate. Fatima Sultan's life exposes the uncomfortable truth that luxury does not equal freedom, and that silence can be enforced as effectively as chains. Her story forces a final question that history still avoids. How many princesses lived and died unheard, their suffering buried beneath ceremony, obedience, and the needs of empire?